This is part 4 of the Kyosho Lazer ZX6 build series. Let's change that. So as you can see, I have the steering rack assembled, the front and rear chassis braces assembled and mounted, and the center drivetrain assembled. So the first thing you do from the last video is put together the steering rack, and I have that right here. So it's these arms here are 3 pieces. There's 1 piece here and then 2 pieces here. And depending on how you mount your servo, you can either set up this arm here to be straight for the sideways mounting servo or angled for the straight mounting servo. Okay, I'm going with the sideways mounting servo because I'm running a front motor configuration, and that this will give you the most room to mount my electronics. So basically this piece here, if you're familiar with the old Kyosho Lazer ZXR or the ZX from way back in the early 90s, this may look very familiar to you, this particular type of assembly. So they basically replicated that here. I do not quite remember if the ZX5 had the same thing. It's been a while since I've had my ZX5. But in any case, this is how it works. You do get adjustable Ackerman because the ball studs for the inner steering link mount front to rear. So you can just put washers in here to move the ball stud forward or backward. Although this cross brace here is aluminum, so you just have to make sure to use thread lock when you mount these particular ball studs. Okay, and what I found so far is everywhere in the manual where you're screwing a screw into a metal part, the manual does not tell you to use thread lock. So you just have to keep track of that yourself and remind yourself whenever you're putting anything, a ball stud or a screw or whatever into metal, use thread lock. Blue thread lock should be more than sufficient. So then you put that together, you mount these screws through these little washers that go through the cross brace, and then they screw into these arms here for the steering rack. The actual bushing itself that goes through the cross brace is a little thicker than the cross brace itself. I presume that's meant so that when you tighten the screw down, you can tighten it all the way and it won't bind up the steering, because the inside of the cap of the screw head doesn't grind against the cross brace. So that's a smart design, although the trade-off there is because the bushing is a little bit thicker than the thickness of the cross brace, you do get a little bit of native slop when the parts are brand new. It can still wiggle a little bit. It's not bad. It's fine, but that's part of what you get with doing it this way, with making that bushing a little on the thicker side. I suspect it'll hold up okay. I mean, you have bearings in here in these arms, but where the screw rotates, the screw is fixed, and so these bushings basically slide against or grind against the screw here. So as the screw threads wear out, as that bushing moves back and forth when you steer the car, the steering slop, I suspect, will start to come in here within these bushings and these screws. So we'll see how that goes. But the B44 has kind of a similar assembly, so I'm not terribly concerned about it. Anyway, once you get through mounting the steering rack, and were there any other particular comments I had? You put some spacers down, and then you mount these on your post, and then you have to put these screws in. You don't tighten them down all the way. That's what this means in the manual. You just kind of semi-tighten it down. You just screw them in a little bit, because you have to take these out later when you come in and mount your... Oops, we get a little bit more forward in the... Yeah, so when you come in and mount this brace, you have to take these screws out, mount the brace, and put those screws back in. And as you can see, that brace is 2 pieces here, okay? And it's a very similar assembly for the rear. And then once you get through that, you put your slipper clutch together. This, if I remember correctly, is the same setup as with the ZX5. So you have the actual slipper pads here. I think they're aluminum. They feel pretty light, and they're separate from the drive hubs that actually connect to your dog bones. So assembling this can be tricky if you're not that good, because on other cars like the B44, for example, the actual slipper plate and the drive hub are one single unit. Here they're two separate units. I can only imagine they did that so that you can replace these plates without having to replace the drive hub or vice versa. Okay, that's kind of neat. The actual slipper pads are special Kyosho slipper pads. They have a particular shape, which means that, and the way that they slot into the spur gear means the spur gear has to accommodate these pads. So these spur gears, you can only use Kyosho spur gears. So if you want to play around with gearing or anything, I'm pretty sure you can only use Kyosho spur gears for this. I don't know if J Concepts or Robinson Racing make spur gears that can accommodate these slippers. I'm pretty sure they don't. It comes with a 78 tooth spur gear, and make sure to set your gearing accordingly for that, depending on how many turns you're running in your brushless motor. Okay, so you set this all up, and then you mount your motor mount, and then the other half of the spur gear mount. There's a motor mount and the spur gear mount are one unit here. This is a nice aluminum unit here. There's a plastic unit on the other side that finishes off the spur gear mount, and then you plop this in. But when you plop this in, first you have to mount the front dog bone, plop it in, put the cap on, you mount the rear dog bone. And as you assemble this whole slipper assembly, if I go back here, this is the rear drive cup for this center shaft. It has, it mounts onto the shaft with a grub screw. And there's a little slot here that the grub screw tightens into. But what happens is, because you want to have nice tight tolerances between the dog bone and the drive cups, you actually have to, you don't tighten this all the way down. You move this drive cup all the way in, and then you tighten it down on the shaft just a little bit, not all the way. That way you have enough space when this is mounted and this is mounted and all locked in to mount this dog bone, and then slide it down and align it with the drive cup, and then loosen this grub screw, slide this back, and then tighten it down on the little slot on the shaft here. So you have to make sure that when you mount this, that grub screw or set screw is in line with that flat spot on the shaft, because you won't be able to see that flat spot when you move this drive cup back. Okay, it's completely blocked from your view. So make sure it's lined up first when you first assemble this, and then you'll be okay. I am a little surprised that they decided to use dog bones instead of CVAs for the center part of the drivetrain. The B44 uses CVAs, and you have a CVA. The CVA joint extends out from the gearbox, and then there's a dog bone that connects to the drive cups in the center. Here, it's just a standard dog bone. I thought that was just kind of interesting. I'm not sure why they chose to do that. I'm not sure if there's any particular advantage or disadvantage to doing so. Maybe it's just more reliable than having a CVA. That's a possibility. What is notable to me is that these dog bones are, the front is long and the rear is short, but it's I would say kind of a better distribution than what you had on the ZX5. On the ZX5, this spur gear was all the way up front, and so you had a really long dog bone to the rear and a really, really tiny dog bone up front. So if that front dog bone popped out, or if you're doing something to service the front and you have to take that dog bone out, mounting it back in is a real pain in the butt. And that rear dog bone that was long, if because it's longer, it could be easier to bend. I didn't have problems with bending it, but it could happen. So this is a more even distribution of dog bone lengths, and it makes it easier to install. That's the most crucial part. So yeah, center drivetrain, steering rack, or you can see the buggy, you know, pretty much starting to take shape now. What comes after this, perhaps predictably, we, you know, very briefly mount the battery post. Okay, fine. And then we get to the hub carriers and CVAs. These universal, this is a, I just want to make sure, this is a CVD, I think. Anyway, these universal joints come pre-assembled. So if I go into, back here, hold on a second, yeah, you can see right here, see, pre-assembled. So that's kind of cool. It does save you a little bit of time assembling the kit, because, you know, in the B44, that's I keep using that as an example, you have to assemble your CVAs. In the B5, the B5M, the T4, all the associated kits, you have to assemble the CVAs. It doesn't take that long, but it's kind of neat that they already did it for you, and it comes all greased up and everything, so it's just ready to go. So far, this build has been pretty good. You know, the manual can use a few improvements here or there. Like, for example, reminding you to use thread lock when you need to use thread lock. But otherwise, I haven't found any steps yet that are inaccurate. And the ZX5, I think there were a few steps in the manual that were actually wrong. They told you to use like the wrong screw or something. This is, at least up to this step, it's going well. The parts arrangement is a little weird because you end up with, you know, all these screws that you eventually have to get through throughout the build. So just make sure you have a little, you know, tackle box or parts box or something to put the screws in. So like this I had from parts bag 1, these were from bag 2, these were from bag 3. As you go throughout the build, it kind of tells you, you know, which bag you need to use to draw screws from. And I have a set of calipers here that I use to just measure every screw that I use to make sure I'm using the right screw. So as long as you do that, as long as you take your time with this build, it should go just fine. It shouldn't really be a problem. You know, some of you may be used to basically tearing open like a B5M and just ripping through the build in 2 or 3 hours, which is possible because those manuals are a little easier to work through and the parts organization is much more modular. But because of that, you end up with a lot more waste. You know, even though this is one big bag, it's just a single bag. You don't have a million little parts bags and plastic bags that you end up throwing out. So in some ways this is bad, and other ways it's actually good. So you just got to pick your poison there. In any case, we're going to get to this, and then when I think it's appropriate, I will make another video. Thanks for watching.